Leah Washington was only 12 years old when she stood up in front of her entire town, determined to defend her family's honor. Growing up in a community where people like Mr. Charles Porter, a powerful, prejudiced businessman, looked down on black families like hers, Leah knew what it meant to stay silent and keep the peace. But when Mr. Porter made a public insult about her family's worth, Leah's silence broke. With her heart racing, Leah spoke out, her words ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. She called for the respect her family deserved, her courage igniting something powerful in the community. Her bold stand marked the beginning of a change her town desperately needed, a transformation that brought neighbors closer, bridged divides, and showed everyone what true unity and respect could look like. Inspired by Leah's courage? Don't miss more stories like this. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for inspiring tales of resilience, unity, and standing up for what's right. Tap that subscribe button and join our community today. Leah Washington adjusted her Sunday dress, feeling the gentle breeze of a southern morning brushing against her skin. Her family's house, a modest but beautifully kept home with bright marigolds lining the walkway, was the pride of her parents, Nina and Marcus Washington. Leah could see them now, mingling with friends and neighbors at the park's annual community gathering. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and soulful jazz floated through the air as families gathered on picnic blankets and children chased each other across the open field. But Leah's stomach twisted with an unshakable feeling. Just a few minutes earlier, she had overheard Mr. Charles Porter, one of the wealthiest men in town, saying things that made her heart sink. "Folks like the Washingtons," he had muttered to a small group, his voice low but laced with contempt, "acting like they belong here, but we all know they come from nothing." Leah had felt her cheeks burn and her fists clenched at her sides. Her parents had worked hard their entire lives. Her father owned a small landscaping business, his hands calloused from long hours transforming people's yards into places of beauty. Her mother, a schoolteacher, was known for her kindness and dedication to her students. They both instilled values in her: honesty, respect, and the belief that everyone deserved kindness. "Leah, honey," her mother's warm voice broke through her thoughts. Leah looked up to see Nina waving at her, holding a plate of food she'd fixed just for her. Her mother's smile was as bright as the sun, but Leah couldn't shake the anger simmering inside her. She joined her family, silently taking the plate. Across the park, Mr. Porter was still there, laughing with his circle, casting the occasional disdainful glance toward her family and others who didn't meet his standard. She wished she could march right up to him and demand that he apologize, but every time she imagined it, fear crept in. After all, who would listen to a 12-year-old girl, especially when Mr. Porter had money and influence on his side? Leah watched her father laugh as he talked with Mr. Williams, their elderly neighbor, who was telling one of his famously long stories. Leah noticed how her father's hand rested on Mr. Williams's shoulder, nodding attentively, showing respect and care, as he always did. Leah thought, why couldn't everyone see her family as she did? As the event continued, Leah's mind kept racing back to Mr. Porter's words. It was one thing to insult her, but to attack her family, to undermine everything they stood for, that felt unbearable. She kept glancing in his direction, and every time she did, a new wave of anger pulsed through her veins. Finally, she couldn't keep quiet. She turned to her mother. "Mama, why do people like Mr. Porter think they're better than us?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "We've been here as long as anyone else." Her mother gave her a long look, sighing softly. "Leah, some folks think their money or status makes them better, but it's not what you have that makes you valuable. It's how you treat others. And one day, people like him will have to answer for their actions. But what if they never do? Leah asked, her voice tinged with frustration. What if everyone just lets him talk like that? Her father had overheard, and he knelt down beside her, looking Leah directly in the eyes. Sweetheart, I know it's hard, but remember, we don't let people like that make us feel small. We don't let them change who we are. Leah nodded, trying to absorb her parents' wisdom. But it felt like swallowing stones. It just didn't sit right with her, staying silent while someone disrespected her family. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the gathering as the town's annual award ceremony began. Leah's parents turned their attention to the stage, but Leah felt herself drifting away from the crowd. She walked quietly toward the gazebo, seeking a moment alone. And that's when she saw him, Mr. Porter, standing just a few feet away, complaining about the quality of people the town allowed in its ranks. Back in my father's day, he was saying loudly, people knew their place. His friends chuckled in agreement, and Leah's fists clenched once more. Before she could think twice, Leah felt the words bubbling up from deep within her, and suddenly they were spilling out. "Excuse me, Mr. Porter?" Her voice, though quiet, cut through the air with startling clarity. The small group turned to look at her, surprised. "Yes," Mr. Porter replied, his eyebrows raised, his lips curling in a faint smirk. "I heard what you said," Leah began, her heart pounding, "about my family and about other families here. I just want to say, it's wrong. My parents have worked hard to be here. They're kind, decent people. They give back to this town every single day. They don't deserve the things you're saying." There was a shocked silence, and Leah's cheeks flushed. She felt the weight of all the eyes on her, yet something inside her wouldn't let her back down. "Oh, really?" Mr. Porter replied, crossing his arms. "Well, young lady, it sounds to me like you're awfully full of yourself." His gaze hardened. "Maybe you should learn a little respect." Leah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I do respect people who earn it. But my family doesn't need your approval to be proud of who they are." Her voice, though shaking, held a conviction that surprised even her. At that moment, someone from the crowd stepped closer. It was Ms. Ruby Johnson, a retired teacher who had always been kind to Leah. She looked at Mr. Porter with a frown. "Mr. Porter, I think the young lady has made her point." More people began to gather around, murmurs rippling through the crowd as they realized what was happening. And in that instant, Leah could feel the shift. Her small act of courage had struck a chord. She saw friends, neighbors, even strangers nodding in quiet agreement. Leah felt her heart swell with pride, a pride that no amount of Mr. Porter's words could take away. And as she looked up at her parents, who stood watching with tears in their eyes, she knew this moment would change everything. Leah looked at her parents, who were now standing at the edge of the gathering crowd, watching her with expressions of mixed awe and pride. She took another deep breath, realizing she couldn't back down now. As she looked around, she saw familiar faces, neighbors, friends, her teachers. Their gazes held something she hadn't expected, admiration. Mr. Porter, however, still wore a sneer. "Admiration won't pay the bills or fix the issues your kind brings to this town," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "This town was better off when people knew their place." The words stung, cutting deep, but Leah felt a new strength bubbling up within her. She could see the town's eyes on him now, too, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock and anger. Mr. Porter was revealing his prejudice for everyone to see. It wasn't just about her family anymore, it was about how he saw anyone who didn't meet his standards. Leah's voice steadied. "Maybe what needs to change isn't the people, Mr. Porter," she said, her words slow and clear. Maybe it's the way we treat each other. Maybe kindness and respect are what will make this town stronger. You talk about my family like we haven't worked hard, but we've done as much as anyone else here. The crowd around them murmured, nodding, and Leah noticed Ms. Ruby Johnson step forward, standing a bit closer to her. "Young lady has a point, Charles," Ms. Ruby said, her voice steady and firm. "You can't keep trying to run this town as though it belongs to you alone." Leah's heart beat fiercely, yet there was something reassuring in Ms. Ruby's presence, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. It was a feeling she hadn't expected, to have someone stand beside her. It was as though her bravery had ignited something in others, giving them the strength to speak up as well. A voice called out from the back of the crowd. "I've seen Leah's father working my land for years," said Mr. Williams, the elderly neighbor who had known her family for as long as she could remember. "Never seen a man work harder. And as for her mother, my own grandchildren come home talking about all they've learned from her. If that doesn't mean they belong here, I don't know what does." Mr. Porter opened his mouth to reply, but it was clear the mood of the crowd had shifted. His haughty expression faltered, and he scanned the faces in front of him, as if hoping to find someone who would support him. But no one stepped forward. Even his friends glanced down, uncomfortable. Leah held her breath, watching as his confidence seemed to waver. In the silence that followed, her father stepped forward, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Leah looked up at him, and he gave her a small, proud smile. Then he turned his gaze on Mr. Porter, his voice calm but unwavering. "We came here like anyone else," her father said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We've worked hard and done right by this town, and we'll keep doing so, but respect goes both ways, and if you can't show us that, Mr. Porter, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong." The crowd murmured again, louder this time, and Leah felt a wave of pride and relief wash over her. For so long she had been taught to keep her head down, to bear the weight of prejudice with quiet dignity. But this moment felt like a new beginning, as if her small act of bravery had opened the door to something greater, a shift in the town's spirit, a reminder that they didn't have to silently accept unfair treatment. As the tension broke, people began to clap softly at first, then louder, until it became a rousing cheer. Leah felt her cheeks grow warm as she looked around at the crowd, her friends and neighbors smiling back at her, nodding their approval. She had spoken up, and for the first time it felt like her voice had power. She felt her parents' arms around her, pulling her into a warm embrace, and she knew that they were as proud of her as she was of them. Mr. Porter gave the crowd one last scowl before retreating, his shoulders stiff and his face red. It was clear that he was unaccustomed to being called out, especially by someone as young as Leah. And though she knew he might still hold his prejudices, it didn't matter as much anymore. She'd shown him and the entire town that her family's pride and strength could not be diminished by hateful words. As the crowd began to disperse, Ms. Ruby leaned down and placed a gentle hand on Leah's shoulder. "You did a brave thing today, child," she said, her eyes glinting with approval. "Bravery doesn't always mean being loud. Sometimes it means standing up and speaking the truth, even when it's the hardest thing to do." Leah nodded, feeling the weight of Ms. Ruby's words settle over her like a protective cloak. She hadn't realized how much it would mean to speak up, to feel, even for a moment, that her voice mattered. She glanced at her parents, her father's proud smile, and her mother's tear-brimmed eyes, and felt a quiet peace settle in her heart. As they began walking home, hand in hand, Leah looked back at the park where a few families lingered, watching them with soft, admiring smiles. She knew that things might not change overnight, that people like Mr. Porter would still be in the world. But she also knew something else. She had the strength to stand up, and she wasn't alone. Her voice, though small, had been heard. And in that moment, it felt like just the beginning. As Leah and her family walked home from the park, a new energy seemed to course through her. The events of the day replayed in her mind, the courage she hadn't known she had, the support from her parents, Ms. Ruby's comforting presence, and even Mr. Williams, who spoke up for them in front of the crowd. For the first time, she felt as though her words could shape the world around her. That evening, as they gathered around the kitchen table for dinner, her mother and father exchanged quiet, proud smiles. They didn't bring up what had happened at the park, but the way her father's hand lingered on her shoulder and her mother's gentle look across the table said more than words could. Leah, though still a little shaken, felt a growing sense of pride swell within her. She'd faced someone who seemed untouchable, and she hadn't flinched. The next day at school, Leah expected whispers or stares, but what she didn't expect was the number of classmates who approached her with admiration. Some of her friends, like Amaya and Tyrone, gave her high fives and words of encouragement. But even classmates she didn't know well, and even some teachers, stopped her in the hall to say, "Good for you, Leah," or "It's about time someone stood up to Mr. Porter." For the first time, Leah felt that her voice had not only reached her town, but had echoed further than she'd ever imagined, but not all reactions were positive. At lunch, Evelyn Carson, a girl whose family was close to Mr. Porter, glared at Leah as she walked by. Evelyn's nose wrinkled in disdain. "Do you think you're some kind of hero now?" she sneered, loud enough for the other kids to hear. Leah felt a flash of anger, but took a deep breath, remembering her mother's advice. She didn't respond, instead taking her seat beside Amaya, who shot Evelyn a look of her own. "Forget her," Amaya whispered. "Some people just don't get it. She's just mad because you made her uncle look bad." Leah smiled gratefully, glad for Amaya's support. Still, Evelyn's words lingered with her. She'd known there might be people who wouldn't like what she did. Her mother's words about standing up for her family without letting others get under her skin returned to her, steadying her nerves. Leah took a deep breath, resolving to let it slide. At home that evening, her father sat her down in the living room. He gave her a long look, one that was both proud and concerned. "You know, Leah," he started, "I'm glad you spoke up. But speaking the truth isn't always easy. There are some people, like Mr. Porter, who don't change just because they're called out. You might face a few more hard looks and words from folks like him, but don't let that shake you." "I know, Dad," Leah replied, her voice soft but resolute. "I don't want to stay silent just because some people don't like it." Her father nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Good. Just remember, you're part of a long line of people who stood up when things weren't right. And you're not alone. Ms. Ruby, Mr. Williams, your mother, and me, we're all with you." Leah took her father's words to heart. That night, she lay awake, thinking of the generations who had come before her, people who had faced far worse but had refused to stay silent. For the first time, she felt connected to something bigger than herself. It was more than just her family. It was a legacy of resilience and courage. The following week, Ms. Ruby Johnson stopped by the house with a book in hand. Leah's mother invited her in for tea, and Ms. Ruby sat on their couch, her wise eyes sparkling as she handed Leah the book. "I thought you might like this," Ms. Ruby said. "It's about some remarkable folks who did what you did. They spoke up, even when it was hard." Leah looked down at the worn cover. "Voices of Courage, stories from the civil rights movement. She felt a thrill as she traced her fingers over the title, sensing the weight of those words. "Thank you, Ms. Ruby," she whispered, feeling the significance of the gesture. Ms. Ruby leaned in, her voice gentle yet firm. "Leah, what you did was brave, and sometimes bravery can feel like you're standing alone, but you're part of a history much bigger than Mr. Porter's small-mindedness. Remember that. You don't need his approval or anyone else's to know what's right." Leah spent the next few days devouring the book, each page introducing her to people who had stood up to power, who had faced unimaginable obstacles but refused to back down. As she read, Leah felt a new layer of courage building inside her. Each story felt like a reminder that speaking out wasn't just a momentary act of bravery, it was a lifetime commitment to standing for justice. One afternoon after school, as Leah was walking home, she saw James Franklin, a young lawyer who had grown up in their town. She'd seen him at the park that day, standing quietly in the background during her confrontation with Mr. Porter. As she passed him, he gave her a nod of recognition. "Leah Washington," he called out, stopping her with a kind smile. "I wanted to say I admired what you did the other day. Not everyone has that kind of courage, especially at your age." Leah felt her cheeks warm, but she returned his smile. "Thank you, Mr. Franklin," she replied, unsure of what else to say. James looked thoughtful. "You know, speaking up is one thing, but change comes from persistence. People in power like Mr. Porter don't always step aside easily. But what you did reminded folks here that we can challenge the old ways." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "If you ever need someone in your corner, I'm here. And I know others are too." Leah's heart lifted at his words. She felt a sense of connection with him, and with others in the town who seemed to understand what she was doing. As she continued walking home, she thought about his words. Change comes from persistence. It was as if each conversation, each word of encouragement was fortifying her, building her up for whatever lay ahead. But things weren't quiet on Mr. Porter's end. A few days later, Leah's family started hearing whispers from others in town. Word had it that Mr. Porter was angry, frustrated that he'd been publicly challenged by a young girl. It seemed he was trying to stir up resentment, bringing up old, unfounded complaints about Leah's father's business practices and questioning her mother's influence at the school. He wanted people to remember his power and authority to silence anyone who might support the Washingtons. Yet, Leah noticed that many of the townspeople were less receptive to his complaints than he might have hoped. People who had admired her father's landscaping work, or whose children had been taught by her mother, dismissed Mr. Porter's words, knowing how much the Washingtons had contributed to the community. In fact, some began questioning Mr. Porter's motives, murmuring quietly about whether he was more interested in maintaining his power than truly helping the town. Leah noticed her parents handling the rumors with quiet dignity. They went about their days as they always had, her father heading out early with his tools, her mother grading papers late into the night. Leah was inspired by their resilience, their refusal to let Mr. Porter's words get under their skin. She saw in them the same strength she had read about in Ms. Ruby's book. One afternoon, as she was helping her father in their garden, she gathered the courage to ask him about it. "Dad," she began, her voice tentative, "how do you keep going when people say things like that? Doesn't it hurt?" Her father looked up, his face softened by a gentle smile. "Leah, people will always have something to say. Some folks, like Mr. Porter, think they can define us by their words. But they don't know us." He wiped his hands on a cloth and sat down beside her. "We know who we are. And if we let their words stop us, we're letting them win. Our strength comes from our work, from our family, from how we treat others, not from what anyone like him thinks. Leah nodded, feeling a new layer of understanding settle within her. It wasn't just about standing up once, it was about holding on to the truth of who she and her family were, even when others tried to tear them down. The days passed, and Leah's world slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But something had shifted. At school, Leah noticed the subtle ways that people seemed to treat her differently. Her classmates looked at her with a new kind of respect, and even her teachers seemed to acknowledge her with approving nods and smiles. Though Mr. Porter still held his grudges, Leah felt her courage ripple outward, inspiring quiet change among those who might have once remained silent. But tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface of the town. Mr. Porter was persistent in his efforts to tarnish her family's reputation. He spread fresh rumors about her father's business and hinted that the Washingtons were overstepping their place in the community. Though Leah's parents remained calm and assured, she could see the worry etched in her mother's face and the quiet anger in her father's eyes as he carried on with his daily work. They still went about their lives with dignity, but Leah knew the toll of standing up to Mr. Porter was beginning to weigh on them. One Saturday morning, Leah was helping her mother set up a booth at the town's farmers' market, where local vendors sold fresh produce, handmade crafts, and baked goods. It was one of her family's favorite weekend rituals, and her mother loved chatting with friends and neighbors who stopped by. Leah was adjusting a basket of apples when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Well, well, if it isn't the Washingtons," Mr. Porter sneered as he strolled over with his entourage, his gaze lingering with disdain on their modest setup. "Trying to act like you belong here, as if you haven't brought enough trouble already." Leah felt her cheeks heat, her fists clenching as she braced herself. She looked at her mother, whose face remained calm but firm, as she met Mr. Porter's gaze without wavering. "Good morning, Mr. Porter," her mother replied with quiet composure. "Is there something we can help you with?" "Oh, I just came to see if all the fuss I'd been hearing about your little outburst was true," Mr. Porter replied, a smirk twisting his lips. "It's a shame, really, what some people are teaching their children these days, talking back, causing scenes. Maybe it's time we all remembered the proper way to behave." Leah could feel a storm of emotions rising inside her. She had imagined what she would say if Mr. Porter confronted them again, but now that it was happening, she felt that familiar fear creeping up. But then she looked at her mother, standing so steady and calm, and she knew she couldn't stay silent. "Mr. Porter," Leah began, her voice steady and strong, "we're here because we belong, just like everyone else. And if people are talking about what I said, maybe it's because they know it's the truth. Respect is something that everyone deserves, not just those with money or influence." A hush fell over the surrounding booths as people began to listen. Leah could feel the weight of their attention, but she refused to falter. She met Mr. Porter's eyes, her voice firm. "My parents have worked hard to build a life here, to contribute to this community, and nothing you say will change that." Mr. Porter's face darkened, but before he could respond, a familiar voice called out from behind him. "Leah's right," came Ms. Ruby's voice as she stepped forward, her eyes fierce with pride. "It's time we stop pretending that anyone in this town has more right to be here than others. The Washingtons have done nothing but good for this community, and it's high time we all recognize that." More voices rose up in agreement, and Leah felt her heart swell as she realized that others were standing with her. Mr. Williams, their elderly neighbor, added his voice to the chorus. I remember a time when people were proud to see families like the Washingtons coming up and doing well, he said, his voice quivering but strong. They're the kind of folks we should all be thankful for, not tearing down. Mr. Porter looked around, clearly taken aback by the show of support. His usual smug expression faltered, replaced by an uncertain frown as he saw the faces around him, people he had known for years, people he thought supported him, now watching him with disapproval. Leah felt a surge of hope, realizing that her actions, her bravery, had done more than she could have imagined. But Mr. Porter wasn't one to be easily silenced. He straightened, his voice cold and steely. "Well, it seems the town's gotten soft," he muttered, casting a disparaging look at the crowd. "I thought we had standards here." Leah's father, who had been listening quietly, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Porter," he said, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "Standards are more than wealth and status. Standards are about how we treat one another. I believe in a community where everyone has a chance, where hard work and respect mean more than a last name or a bank account." His words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and Leah saw people nodding, their expressions supportive. Mr. Porter seemed to realize he had lost the crowd, and with a final, withering glance at Leah and her family, he turned and stalked off, his entourage following in embarrassed silence. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Ms. Ruby gave Leah a warm smile and a gentle pat on the shoulder. "You've done something powerful, Leah," she said. "Not everyone is brave enough to stand up, but you showed everyone here that they have a voice too." Leah looked around, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and relief. She hadn't just stood up for her family, she had reminded her town of the values they claimed to cherish. She could feel the impact of her words settling over the market like a new sense of purpose, a fresh reminder of what community was supposed to mean. Later that evening, as Leah and her parents walked home under the warm glow of the setting sun, she felt a peace she hadn't known before. They were quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts, but Leah could sense the quiet pride in her parents' expressions. When they arrived home, her father pulled her aside, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Leah," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've done something I couldn't have imagined. Your courage reminded people of what really matters, and you reminded me too." His voice wavered, and Leah saw the glimmer of tears in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, more than I can say." Leah wrapped her arms around him, feeling the weight of his pride settle around her like a warm blanket. In that moment, she understood the depth of her actions, the way her voice had echoed, not just through the market, but through her family, her town, and even through herself. She had stepped up, claimed her place, and spoken a truth that would not be easily forgotten. The days that followed brought a quiet but unmistakable shift in the community. People began to look at Leah's family with new respect, nodding or offering friendly greetings as they passed on the street. Her father's business grew, with neighbors going out of their way to hire him, wanting to show their support. Her mother received thank-you notes from parents whose children had been taught in her classroom, expressing gratitude for her kindness and dedication. And yet Leah knew that not everyone was won over. Mr. Porter and a few of his close friends still held on to their bitterness, casting sidelong glances or making quiet remarks, but they seemed to realize that their influence was weakening, that their old ways of thinking no longer held the power they once did. One afternoon, Leah found herself sitting with Ms. Ruby on her porch, a glass of sweet tea in hand. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the hum of cicadas filled the quiet spaces between their words. Ms. Ruby turned to Leah, her eyes bright with approval. "Child," she said softly, "I've seen a lot of folks come and go in this town, but what you did, that was something special. You've sparked a change here, one that's going to last. It's a reminder to everyone that this town is only as strong as the love and respect we show each other." Leah felt a warm flush spread across her cheeks, humbled by Ms. Ruby's words. She looked out over the town, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't known before. She knew that there would still be challenges, that prejudice and ignorance wouldn't disappear overnight. But she also knew that she had found her voice, and that voice had power. The town had seen what true courage looked like, and Leah had been a part of something much bigger than herself. As she sat with Ms. Ruby, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a peace and pride that settled deep in her heart, a sense of accomplishment that would stay with her always. For the first time, Leah understood what her family's strength truly meant. It wasn't just in their hard work or kindness, it was in their resilience, in their unwavering belief in their right to belong, and in the courage it took to stand tall in the face of those who would try to bring them down. Over the following weeks, Leah felt a subtle but undeniable shift within her community. Her parents were respected more openly than ever, and the quiet support of neighbors like Ms. Ruby and Mr. Williams grew into something Leah never expected. Even people she'd never spoken to before, shopkeepers, teachers, and parents of her classmates, began to offer her friendly smiles or words of encouragement when they saw her around town. She could feel the difference her courage had made, but with this new respect came an even deeper understanding of her family's struggles and of what it meant to live with dignity in the face of prejudice. One day after school, Leah was working on her homework at the kitchen table when her father came in, looking more thoughtful than usual. He hung up his jacket, rubbed his chin, and gave Leah a long look before finally speaking. "Leah," he began, pulling out a chair beside her, "I think it's time you hear something important." Leah set down her pencil, her curiosity piqued by the serious tone in his voice. She could see he'd been carrying the weight of this conversation for some time. He took a breath before continuing. "You know I'm proud of you, more than words can say. But I want you to know that speaking up, it has consequences. And those consequences aren't always easy. People like Mr. Porter don't just back down. They might wait, they might go quiet for a while, but prejudice like his, well, it doesn't just disappear. And you might face more challenges because of it." Leah nodded, absorbing her father's words. She knew he wasn't trying to frighten her, but to prepare her. "I understand, Dad," she replied, her voice steady. "But I don't regret what I said, and if I have to face those challenges again, I think I'd still do the same thing." Her father smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "I know you would, Leah. I know you would." He patted her shoulder, and Leah felt a surge of love and determination. Her father's words echoed her own growing resolve. Standing up for what was right was worth the price. But as much as Leah's family now felt a stronger connection to the community, Mr. Porter had not given up. He was determined to undermine their place in the town, and his methods became subtler, more insidious. He continued to spread rumors, muttering half-truths and exaggerated stories to anyone who would listen. Although he had lost much of his former influence, he managed to sow seeds of doubt and tension in small but noticeable ways. One evening, Leah's family was enjoying a quiet dinner when there was a knock at the door. Her father got up to answer it, and when he returned, Leah saw a dark look cross his face. "What's wrong, honey?" her mother asked gently. Her father sighed, rubbing his temples. "It was a member of the town council," he replied, his voice low. "They've been hearing things, complaints about our business practices, our supposed influence on the community. It's all nonsense, of course, but someone's been stirring the pot." Leah's heart sank. She knew exactly who was behind it. Mr. Porter was finding new ways to push back, to make them feel unwelcome. It was clear he was determined to keep his grip on the town's social dynamics, even if it meant using underhanded tactics. And despite her family's reputation and the support they'd gained, it was evident that some people were still listening to him. As the days passed, Leah's father became more visibly burdened. Some of his regular clients began to cancel their services without explanation. Her mother overheard whispers at the grocery store that made her feel uncomfortable. It was as though an invisible barrier was rising between them and the rest of the town, threatening to undo all the progress Leah had fought so hard to achieve. One afternoon, as she was walking home, Leah saw Ms. Ruby standing outside her front porch, watching her approach with a concerned expression. Leah greeted her, and Ms. Ruby gestured for her to sit with her on the porch swing. "I've heard what's been happening," Ms. Ruby said gently, her voice tinged with sadness. "It's a shame that some folks are so easily swayed by lies and rumors. But Leah, I want you to remember that standing up for what's right doesn't mean the fight ends quickly. Sometimes it's a lifelong journey." Leah nodded, feeling the weight of Ms. Ruby's words. "I thought things were changing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it feels like Mr. Porter's never going to stop. He's just going to keep trying to hurt us." Ms. Ruby took her hand, her grip strong and reassuring. "Leah, you've done more than you know. You've given people the courage to speak up, to question things they'd been afraid to challenge. And you may not see all the results of your bravery right away, but that doesn't mean your efforts are wasted." Leah looked down, processing Ms. Ruby's words. She realized that courage wasn't just about one big moment. It was about standing firm even when things felt uncertain, even when the road ahead seemed endless. She nodded, feeling a renewed strength settle within her. She knew that the fight for respect and justice was far from over, but she was ready to face it. Over the following weeks, small acts of solidarity began to emerge in the community. Some of the townsfolk, inspired by Leah's resilience, started quietly supporting her family's business. Neighbors offered to help with yard work, and friends brought over food and supplies. It was clear that while Mr. Porter's influence lingered, there were people who refused to let his prejudice define the town's future. One day, Leah's father came home with surprising news. "James Franklin stopped by today," he said, referring to the young lawyer who had admired Leah's bravery. "He's been hearing about the trouble Mr. Porter's been causing, and he offered to help. He wants to look into the claims against our business to set the record straight." Leah's heart lifted. James Franklin was known for his dedication to justice, and his offer felt like a light in the darkness. "Do you think he'll be able to stop Mr. Porter?" she asked, hope fluttering in her chest. Her father nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "If anyone can, it's James. And it's not just for us. He believes this town should stand for something better. He's not just doing it for us. He's doing it for the whole community." Over the next few weeks, Leah noticed the subtle changes that James's involvement began to bring. The rumors about her family slowly dissipated as townsfolk started seeing through Mr. Porter's tactics. James spoke to those who had once trusted Mr. Porter and helped them understand the truth about her family's contributions and integrity. One evening, Leah's family received an invitation to a town council meeting where the community was invited to discuss the future of the town's policies and values. Leah's heart raced as they entered the hall, unsure of what to expect. She noticed that Mr. Porter was sitting near the front, his expression stiff and guarded, as townsfolk gathered around, quietly chatting. As the meeting began, James Franklin stood up to address the crowd. His calm but authoritative voice filled the hall as he spoke about the importance of fairness and unity. He referenced Leah's courage, subtly reminding the council of the values they claimed to uphold. "We are all here to build a better community," James said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "And that starts with respect for every family, every individual who contributes to the heart of this town. The Washingtons have shown us what it means to stand for something, even in the face of prejudice." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Leah looked around and saw heads nodding, faces full of recognition and respect. For the first time, she saw her family's efforts mirrored in the eyes of the people who had once been swayed by Mr. Porter's influence. Finally, a voice spoke up from the back of the hall. "I think it's time we made some changes," called Mr. Williams, his voice strong despite his age. "This town is better than the old ways. We need to welcome all our neighbors and treat them with the respect they deserve." As more people voiced their agreement, Leah could feel the energy in the room shift. It was as if her small act of courage had unlocked something deeper within the town, a willingness to confront old biases and embrace a new path forward. Even those who had once stayed silent now found their voices echoing sentiments of unity and change. At the close of the meeting, the town council agreed to review and revise policies that had been sources of division. Mr. Porter left the hall quietly, his influence diminished as the community rallied together in support of fairness and inclusivity. As Leah walked home with her family, she felt an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. Her courage had sparked a movement that would continue to grow, one that would shape her town for generations to come. And though she knew the journey was far from over, she also knew that she wasn't alone, that she had a community, a family, and friends who would stand by her every step of the way. Under the stars that night, Leah felt a peace that ran deep. She had learned that true courage was a quiet strength that could inspire change far beyond her own life. And as she gazed up at the night sky, she knew she'd carry that strength with her, for herself, her family, and her community. As the seasons changed, the effects of Leah's courage continued to ripple through the town. The town council began making real strides in improving community relations, and the spirit of unity grew stronger. Leah and her family noticed a newfound warmth wherever they went. Neighbors waved from their porches, shopkeepers greeted them with enthusiasm, and even strangers offered them nods of respect. For the first time, Leah felt that the town truly embraced her family, seeing them not as outsiders, but as equals and friends. Still, the shadows of Mr. Porter's lingering resentment were not completely gone. He remained in town, quietly keeping his distance from Leah's family, his pride dented but not defeated. Leah could sense that he had not entirely given up. His narrowed glances across the street or cold silence during community events hinted at a bitterness he couldn't seem to shake. And though Leah's initial anger had faded, a part of her worried that Mr. Porter's prejudice might someday lead to another confrontation. One chilly autumn afternoon, Leah was returning home from school when she saw Mr. Porter's car parked by the side of the road, the hood popped open, steam rising from the engine. Leah hesitated, feeling a mix of emotions, annoyance, suspicion, and a flicker of empathy. Despite everything he had done, she couldn't ignore someone in need, even if that person was Mr. Porter. Taking a steadying breath, Leah approached him. "Mr. Porter, do you need help?" she asked, her voice cautious yet kind. He looked up, surprised, and for a brief moment, embarrassed. His face hardened as though he was preparing to refuse her offer. But as he glanced at the smoking engine, he sighed, clearly aware he had little choice. "The engine overheated," he muttered, "and I don't have my phone with me to call for assistance." Leah nodded, pulling out her own phone. "I can call my dad. He knows a lot about engines. He might be able to help you." Mr. Porter hesitated, his pride visibly grappling with his need. But Leah didn't wait for him to answer. She dialed her father, and within a few minutes he arrived, his toolkit in hand. Leah watched as her father worked on Mr. Porter's car with quiet efficiency, saying little but showing the respect and patience he had always displayed, even to those who had wronged him. After fixing the issue, her father closed the hood, wiping his hands on a rag. "That should get you home, Mr. Porter. Just make sure to get it checked soon," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. Mr. Porter looked at him, and for a moment Leah thought he might express gratitude, but instead he gave a curt nod, muttering a stiff "thank you," before getting into his car and driving away. Leah's father watched him go, then turned to her with a soft smile. "Sometimes, Leah," he said, "the best way to handle someone's hatred is by showing them kindness. It may not change their heart, but it keeps our own clear." Leah absorbed his words, realizing her father's quiet strength was a lesson in itself. She knew now that true courage wasn't only about standing up in moments of conflict. It was about living with integrity, even when faced with people who might never change. As winter settled in, the town continued to grow closer, united by the spirit of acceptance Leah's bravery had sparked. Christmas was just around the corner, and the town's annual holiday festival brought everyone together for lights, music, and food. Leah's family joined in the festivities, setting up a small booth where her father sold handcrafted ornaments, while her mother offered hot cocoa to visitors. The festival was bustling with energy and laughter, a contrast to the tense gatherings of the past. Leah felt a thrill as she wandered through the lively crowd, spotting familiar faces and exchanging greetings. It was as if the entire town had been given a fresh start, their hearts open and warm. Amid the laughter and music, Leah noticed Mr. Porter standing alone, his face shadowed as he watched the joyful scene around him. His expression was unreadable, but Leah felt a pang of sadness. She could see he was isolated, his former influence now diminished, and the distance between him and the community seemed vast. Taking a deep breath, Leah decided to approach him. She didn't know what she'd say, but she felt an instinctive pull to reach out. "Mr. Porter," she said softly as she neared him. He turned to look at her, his face clouded with an odd mixture of pride and pain. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of the festival fading into the background. Leah searched for the right words, something that might bridge the chasm between them, even if only a little. "It's a beautiful festival, isn't it?" she finally said, gesturing toward the lights and decorations around them. Mr. Porter nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "It is," he replied, his voice surprisingly soft. "I remember when my father used to bring me here as a boy. Back then, this town was very different." Leah looked at him, sensing a story behind his words. "Different how?" she asked gently. He sighed, glancing down. "People had their places, their roles. There was an order to things, one that people like my father valued." He paused, seeming to struggle with his thoughts. "But I suppose things change. People change." Leah felt a strange understanding pass between them. She knew his view of the world was deeply rooted in his past, shaped by old ways and traditions. but she also sensed a quiet resignation in his voice, as though he knew that the world he longed for was fading away. "Change isn't always easy," Leah said quietly, choosing her words carefully. "But sometimes it can make us better. It can bring people closer, make us stronger." Mr. Porter looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the festive crowd. Leah watched him go, feeling a bittersweet sense of closure. She didn't know if he would ever truly change, but she had reached out, offering him a chance to move forward. Whether he chose to take it was up to him. As the festival continued, Leah joined her family at their booth, her heart filled with a mixture of emotions, pride, peace, and a deep understanding of her place in the town's story. Her actions and the kindness her family had shown had planted seeds of change. She realized that sometimes the most important victories weren't grand or immediate. They were quiet, gradual shifts that took root and grew over time. A few weeks later, the town council announced a new initiative to strengthen community ties, encouraging people of all backgrounds to join and share their stories. Inspired by the events of the past year, they created a committee dedicated to promoting inclusivity and respect, with Ms. Ruby and James Franklin among the members. Leah's family was invited to be honored at the council's next meeting, recognized for the strength and courage they had shown. On the day of the meeting, Leah sat between her parents, listening as James Franklin spoke about the importance of unity. He praised her family for standing firm in the face of adversity, for reminding the town of the values they held dear. Leah felt her cheeks warm as he mentioned her by name, highlighting the bravery she'd shown in standing up to prejudice. When the council invited Leah to say a few words, she rose, her heart pounding as she looked out over the crowd. But as she saw the friendly, familiar faces of her neighbors, the warmth of her family beside her, her nerves settled. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you to everyone who supported my family, who believed in us, and who stood with us. I used to think that courage was something big, something that only adults had. But I've learned that courage is really about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when you're afraid." She glanced at her parents, feeling a surge of love and pride. "And I've learned that kindness is one of the strongest things we can give each other. No matter who we are, where we come from, or what we believe, kindness can bring us together." The room was silent as her words settled, and then, one by one, people began to applaud. Leah felt a wave of gratitude as she sat down, her heart brimming with hope and a sense of belonging. As the meeting concluded, townsfolk gathered around Leah and her family, offering words of thanks and admiration. Leah noticed Ms. Ruby wiping a tear from her eye, smiling proudly, while Mr. Williams gave her a gentle pat on the back. That night, as they walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, Leah felt a profound peace. She knew that she had found her voice, a voice that could inspire change and bridge divides, and she knew that her family's journey had shown their town what true strength looked like, a strength rooted in dignity, resilience, and compassion. With her parents on either side, Leah walked into the future with a heart full of love, courage, and the unshakable knowledge that she too was a vital part of her community's story. As the months passed, the town continued to transform. Small yet meaningful gestures became part of everyday life, people from different backgrounds greeting one another on the street, community events that now welcomed everyone, and families who once kept to themselves now gathering together. Leah could feel a genuine sense of unity taking root in her town, a unity that had begun with her family's stand against prejudice. With the support of James Franklin and Ms. Ruby's committee, the town council introduced new programs to foster inclusivity. Monthly town meetings now included time for community members to share personal stories and histories. Leah's family even led a session on their experience and values, focusing on the importance of respect and resilience. It was inspiring to see neighbors, many of whom had previously stayed silent, speak up with renewed pride in their own family stories. The biggest surprise for Leah came one afternoon when she noticed Mr. Porter at one of the council meetings. He stood at the back, arms folded, with a guarded expression on his face. Although he didn't contribute to the discussion, his presence alone was noteworthy. Leah wondered if, perhaps, he was beginning to see the positive changes around him, even if he wasn't ready to participate. She didn't expect him to change overnight, but a small part of her held on to the hope that he might one day come around. One crisp Saturday in early spring, Leah and her family prepared for a community clean-up day organized by Ms. Ruby's committee. Volunteers would spend the morning picking up trash, repainting benches, and planting flowers in the town square. Leah's parents, ever ready to lend a hand, had brought supplies and set up a table with snacks and water for the volunteers. Leah and her friends Amaya and Tyrone worked side by side, chatting and laughing as they swept the sidewalks and pulled weeds. The camaraderie and joy they felt as they worked together reminded Leah of the community she'd always dreamed of, a community where everyone had a place, where everyone's efforts mattered. Around midday, Leah noticed Mr. Porter watching from a distance, his arms crossed. His face was still impassive, but Leah could tell he was observing the volunteers with interest. His usual scowl softened slightly. She took a breath, deciding to approach him. "Mr. Porter," she said, a friendly smile on her face. "Would you like to join us? We're cleaning up the square and planting flowers." He looked down at her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. For a moment, he seemed ready to brush her off, but then he looked at the volunteers around them, neighbors who had once looked up to him, now happily working together without any regard for status or wealth. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Why are you all doing this?" he asked, his tone almost curious. "What's the point of all this community business?" Leah considered his question, then answered honestly. "Because it makes our town better. It brings people together, helps us get to know each other. My family loves this town, Mr. Porter, and so do a lot of other people. We want to make it a place where everyone feels welcome." He said nothing, but Leah noticed a flicker of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps a faint spark of regret in his eyes. He glanced away, mumbling something about back in his day, before turning and walking back toward his car. Leah watched him go, a mixture of emotions stirring in her heart. Though he hadn't joined them, she felt as if a tiny step had been taken. As the day wound down and the square began to bloom with fresh flowers, Leah and her parents lingered, taking in the beautiful sight of the transformed space. Families laughed together, friends shared stories, and people took pride in what they had accomplished as a group. Leah's heart swelled as she watched everyone coming together with such ease, the divisions of the past fading in the warmth of a shared purpose. In the weeks that followed, more changes continued to unfold. Inspired by the cleanup day, the council approved a new initiative that encouraged local businesses to hire a more diverse range of employees and offered scholarships for high school students to support their community service efforts. Leah's father received requests for help with community landscaping projects, and her mother organized volunteer reading groups at the library, bringing children from all backgrounds together. One afternoon, while Leah was shelving books at the library, James Franklin walked in, a warm smile lighting up his face as he spotted her. "Leah, I was just looking for your mum. Is she around?" "She's helping with the kids' story time in the back," Leah replied. Do you need any help?" James chuckled, shaking his head. "No, but I wanted to tell you something. The town council wants to honor you and your family at the upcoming spring festival." Leah's eyes widened. "Honor us? For what?" "For everything you've done," James replied. "The courage you showed, the positive changes you've inspired. The council wants to officially recognize your family's contributions to the community." Leah felt a wave of excitement and disbelief wash over her. She could hardly believe that what had started as a small act of bravery, standing up for her family, had grown into something that could bring so much change. She nodded, her heart racing. "Thank you, Mr. Franklin. I don't know what to say." James smiled, giving her a reassuring nod. "You've earned it, Leah. You've reminded us all of what community really means." When Leah shared the news with her parents that evening, they were equally surprised and moved. Her mother's eyes brimmed with tears, while her father wrapped her in a proud hug. "You did this, Leah," he said softly. "You showed everyone that we all belong here. This honor is as much yours as it is ours." The weeks leading up to the spring festival were a whirlwind of preparations. The entire town was buzzing with anticipation, and for the first time, Leah felt truly embraced by her community. Even people who had once stayed silent were now active participants, eager to be part of the new chapter unfolding in their town. The day of the festival arrived with a bright, clear sky and warm sunshine. The square was decorated with flowers and colourful banners, and booths lined the streets with food, crafts and games. Leah walked with her family through the crowd, greeted by smiles, waves and heartfelt thanks. Her heart felt full to bursting as she looked around, seeing the town she loved transformed into a place of unity and joy. When it was time for the ceremony, the mayor took the stage, quieting the crowd with a warm smile. "Today," he began, "we gather not only to celebrate spring, but to honor the people who have reminded us of the values we hold dear: courage, unity, and respect. It is my great pleasure to recognize the Washington family who have shown us the power of standing up for what is right." The crowd erupted in applause, and Leah felt her cheeks flush as she and her family stepped onto the stage. She scanned the crowd, spotting Ms. Ruby and James Franklin near the front, both beaming with pride. Even Mr. Williams stood in his usual spot, his eyes twinkling as he gave her a thumbs up. As Leah looked out at the audience, she felt a surge of confidence. The town that had once seemed divided was now a place of acceptance and warmth, a place where her family belonged. When the mayor handed her the microphone, Leah took a steadying breath, her voice clear as she began to speak. "Thank you," she said, her words carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for standing with my family and for supporting one another. I used to think that courage was something hard, something that came only when you had no other choice. But I've learned that courage is simply about doing what's right, even if you're scared. It's about kindness and respect, and those are things that we can all give to each other." Her eyes drifted over the crowd, and for a moment she saw Mr. Porter standing at the edge of the square. Though his face remained impassive, his gaze was fixed on her, and Leah thought she saw a faint glimmer of understanding in his expression. She held his gaze for a brief moment before continuing. "I know this town has its history, and not all of it is easy to face," she said, her voice softening. "But we're all part of its future. We can choose to build a place where everyone feels they belong, where everyone's voice is valued. That's the kind of town I want to be a part of, and I hope we can all work together to make it real." When she finished, the crowd's applause was thunderous. Leah felt her family's hands in hers, felt the warmth of the town's gratitude, and knew that her journey had come full circle. She had found her voice, had seen the impact of her courage, and now she stood before a community that had been changed by it. As the festival continued, Leah wandered through the crowd with a deep sense of fulfillment. She had no idea what challenges the future might hold, but she knew that with her family, her friends, and her community, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The town had embraced her and her family, and together they had created a foundation of hope, strength, and unity that would carry them forward. And in the quiet moments of that evening, as the festivities wound down, Leah realized that she wasn't just part of her community's story. She had helped shape it, and in doing so, had left a legacy that would live on in the hearts of those around her. As the spring festival drew to a close, Leah and her family returned home, that evening feeling a quiet, satisfying joy. They had witnessed the town they loved grow into a community that truly valued unity, kindness, and acceptance, values that they had fought so hard to defend. Leah felt that she had grown, not only in courage but in understanding of the complexities that came with standing up for what was right. Her journey had changed her, and she knew that it had changed her town too. The next day, Leah was walking to school when she noticed Mr. Porter standing outside his home, looking at a row of freshly planted flowers in his front yard. She hesitated, unsure if he'd welcome her approach, but a small voice inside her urged her to speak. She felt that if she left things unfinished, there would always be a lingering tension between them. So, with a deep breath, she approached him. "Good morning, Mr. Porter," she said politely, her voice steady. He looked up, visibly surprised to see her. For a moment, he just stared, and Leah wasn't sure if he would respond, but then he gave a short nod. "Morning, Leah," he replied, his voice gruff, but lacking its usual sharpness. Leah glanced at the flowers, admiring their bright colors against the morning sunlight. "Those are beautiful. Did you plant them yourself?" Mr. Porter shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his neck. "Well, yes," he muttered, looking away as though embarrassed. "Figured I'd try to brighten things up a bit around here." Leah smiled, nodding in approval. "They're a nice addition. It's good to see more people bringing beauty to the town." She paused, unsure of how to phrase what she wanted to say next. But she felt it was important to express it, even if he might not understand fully. "Mr. Porter, I know we've had our differences, but I hope you can see how much this town means to my family, and to me. I'd like to believe that, despite everything, we all want the same thing. A community where everyone feels they belong." Mr. Porter's face softened for a brief moment, and Leah thought she saw a flicker of something, perhaps regret, or maybe even understanding in his eyes. He gave her a slow, almost reluctant nod. "I suppose I may have been a bit hard-headed," he admitted grudgingly. "Old habits are hard to break, you know." Leah nodded, understanding what he meant. "Change isn't easy for anyone," she said gently. "But it's worth it. I think we're all better off when we try to see the good in each other." They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Leah felt a quiet sense of peace. She wasn't sure if Mr. Porter would ever fully change, but she had reached out, and he had met her halfway. It was a start. As she continued on her way to school, Leah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her efforts had helped bring her town closer, and even though Mr. Porter's transformation was incomplete, she knew that her actions had planted seeds of change. She felt lighter, freer, knowing that she had done all she could to foster understanding and kindness, even with someone as resistant as Mr. Porter. Over the next few months, Leah's life settled into a comforting routine. She focused on her studies, spending time with her friends and participating in the community projects that Ms. Ruby and James Franklin continued to organize. She noticed that the bonds within the town had grown stronger. People seemed more eager to lend a hand, more willing to reach across divides that had once kept them apart. Leah's parents were also more involved than ever, helping lead volunteer days and mentoring younger families in the community. The summer arrived with bright, sunny days and endless outdoor activities. Leah spent her free time reading on the porch, helping her father with landscaping projects, and joining her mother at the library for the children's reading group. The library had become a favorite spot for families to gather, and Leah loved watching the little ones lose themselves in the magic of a good story. One afternoon, as she was shelving books, Miss Ruby approached her with a smile. "Leah, I've been meaning to talk to you. The town council wants to establish a youth advisory board, and they'd like you to be a part of it." Leah's eyes widened. "A youth advisory board? What would I be doing?" Ms. Ruby nodded, her eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. "You'd help represent the younger voices in the community, give feedback on issues that affect families and schools, and work with the council to make sure that everyone's needs are being considered. It's a big responsibility, but I think you're ready for it." Leah felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a touch of nervousness. She had never imagined herself in a role like this, but the thought of contributing to her community in a new way filled her with pride. "I'd love to," she said, her voice steady with determination. "I think it's a great idea." The formation of the Youth Advisory Board was announced later that month, and Leah, along with a few other young leaders from her school, was introduced to the community at a town hall meeting. The board's purpose was to give students a voice, to allow them to share their perspectives on issues like school improvements, recreational spaces, and community safety. Leah threw herself into the role, attending meetings, voicing her ideas, and working closely with council members to implement positive changes. She learned a great deal from the experience, how to negotiate, how to listen, and, most importantly, how to advocate for others. She realized that her voice could make a real difference, and she was determined to use it to build a stronger, more inclusive community. One of her first projects with the board was to help establish a mentorship program that paired younger students with older ones. Leah saw it as a way to bridge the gap between grades, to create a network of support where students could learn from one another and feel connected. The program was a success, bringing together students who might never have interacted otherwise, and Leah was proud to see friendships blossom and confidence grow among the participants. As her involvement with the youth board deepened, Leah felt a strong sense of purpose guiding her. She knew that this was just the beginning, that there was still so much more she could do to help her community. With each passing day, her understanding of leadership grew, shaped by the lessons she'd learned from her family, from Ms. Ruby, and from her own experiences. By the time the leaves began to change again, Leah had become a familiar figure in the community, respected for her compassion, wisdom, and unshakable determination. She had found her place, not just as the young girl who had once stood up against prejudice, but as a true leader with a vision for her town's future. On the anniversary of the Spring Festival, the town held a small ceremony to honor the progress they had made over the past year. Leah, standing among her family and friends, felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude as she reflected on how far they had come. She looked around at the faces of her neighbors, each one a part of the story she had helped shape, and felt an unbreakable bond with them. When it was time for her to speak, Leah stepped forward, her voice calm and confident. She spoke of the power of unity, of the strength they had all found in coming together, and of the importance of continuing to stand up for one another. "Our journey isn't over," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. But we've shown that when we come together, when we listen to each other and respect each other, we can make this town a place where everyone belongs. I'm proud of what we've achieved, and I know that we have the courage to keep going, to keep building the future we all believe in. The applause was thunderous, and as Leah looked into the crowd, she saw faces filled with pride, joy, and hope. She realized that her actions had not only changed the town, but had also inspired others to find their own voices, to become leaders in their own right. As she stood with her family, the weight of their journey finally felt complete. The girl who had once felt small and unheard had become a guiding force in her community, her courage lighting the way for others to follow. And though she knew challenges would continue to arise, Leah was ready to face them, secure in the knowledge that she belonged to a community that valued her and stood with her. Together, they would continue to write their story, a story of resilience, unity, and the unshakable belief that every voice mattered. In the months that followed, Leah's role in the community continued to evolve. She grew into her position on the Youth Advisory Board, helping to shape new programs that encouraged young people to take an active part in the town's future. Each step forward, each meeting, and each connection made Leah realize the profound impact that a small spark of courage could have, not only on her life, but on the lives of everyone around her. One crisp autumn morning, Leah was walking to the town square, where the council had planned a gathering to unveil a new mural that local students had painted. The mural, designed by Leah and her classmates, represented the diversity, resilience, and unity that had come to define their community over the past year. It was a vibrant, joyful blend of colors and images, a tapestry of hands and faces, trees and flowers, all woven together to tell the story of their town's journey toward acceptance and understanding. As Leah neared the square, she spotted Ms. Ruby, waiting with a proud smile. James Franklin stood beside her, chatting with other council members, all of whom waved when they saw Leah. She joined them, feeling the warmth of their welcome and reflecting on how much each of these people had meant to her throughout the past year. They had become her mentors, her allies, and her friends. Together, they had transformed this town into something better. When it was time for the ceremony to begin, the mayor stepped forward and gestured toward the mural. Today, we celebrate the dedication of this beautiful artwork, a symbol of our town's resilience and growth, designed and painted by our talented young people. Leah Washington, would you join us to share a few words? Leah took a breath, her heart full as she approached the mural, the crowd hushed and attentive. She gazed at the bright colors and hopeful faces painted on the wall, feeling the weight of her journey and the strength of the community that had supported her. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady. "This mural represents all of us, our past, our present, and our hope for the future. It reminds me that courage isn't something you're born with, it's something you discover along the way, especially when you're surrounded by people who believe in you." Her eyes found Ms. Ruby and her parents in the crowd, their faces shining with pride. "I've learned that a single voice can make a difference, but it's even more powerful when it joins with others. Each one of you has played a part in bringing this town together, and I'm grateful to be a part of this story with you." Leah paused, looking over the crowd, feeling the collective warmth and unity that now bound them together. "There's still work to be done, but I believe that we'll keep moving forward, learning and growing together. Thank you for being here, for supporting each other, and for making this town a place where everyone belongs." The crowd erupted in applause, and Leah felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of completion. She stepped back, watching, As people approached the mural to admire it up close, parents lifting their children to point out the details, students laughing together as they found the spots they had painted themselves. It was a celebration of more than just art. It was a celebration of their community's shared vision. As the crowd began to disperse, Leah found herself standing quietly, absorbing the joy and pride around her. Ms. Ruby joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Leah. You helped lead us here." Leah smiled, feeling the truth of Ms. Ruby's words. "No," she replied softly, glancing at her family, friends, and neighbors. "We all did it. Together." They stood side by side, watching the town that they had built together, one small act of courage at a time, knowing that this was only the beginning of a brighter, more inclusive future for everyone. And in that moment, Leah understood that she was exactly where she was meant to be.